Okay, here we are. We are going to have a presentation by Steve and Cindy Keck on the second Florida adventure. And this is a good presentation because it goes along with our 160-year journey we're on. And Steve and Cindy, why don't you tell us what you're going to do?
Okay, we've been researching Cindy's ancestors, who both of them were in the Florida Brigade with the Army of Northern Virginia. And they survived the war and married into the family sometime after the war. But so with the 160th anniversary, we're going to be following them. They joined at different times. The first one's with the second Florida. The next one later on will join with the fifth Florida. And so what we're going to start, this is the journey that I've been doing a lot of research on, not only what their participation is, but the brigade as a whole. So we get started on this with this very first slide I have here. This is some of the resources that I've been using. Some of them are books, some of them are the newspapers. That quarterly down at the bottom is very useful. And this is probably just a sample of the dozens of references that I used to do the research. And just to let you know that I was not there 160 years ago. So I have to read everything that they have, research it, and extract from that what does happen. We don't have letters from the family. So a lot of this is finding a central path of what transpired over the 4 years that the ancestors in their journey through the Civil War. So if you go on to the next slide, what we're going to do is, first of all, before we start that journey, we have to talk a little bit about Florida before the war as their militias. And when you look at the southern states and how they, different southern states that had already been in the Union, compared to Florida, which was very, very new, it had not been a part of the Union that long before the Civil War. Florida did not have a big population. The state of Florida did not support any militia organizations within their state, where other states like Virginia, Alabama, Georgia, they had militia companies for years. They were used as social events. They were sponsored by either individuals and recognized by the state. Some of them had fought in other previous wars with our country. What you see on your screen right here is a unit that, after Florida seceded from the Union, as we know, the Federals left most of Florida. At certain places, they left their guns behind. That I found out about that. One of them was a place called Fernandina, where they had coastal artillery that protected the St. Johns River. This was after Florida seceded. And to also let you know that in the research, it could get very confusing at this time, because the Confederacy for approximately the first year was very, I'm not going to say disorganized, there are a lot of growing pains. When the Birmingham, I think it was, legislature, the Confederate legislature met government, they appointed certain officers already in the Confederate Army. And these were sent out as representatives of different military districts to oversee the different states in forming up the armies. And one of them was General Bragg, that was sent to Pensacola. When he got down there, and this was shortly after Florida seceded, not too long after that, when he got down there, in some communication he had with the Confederate government and the state of Florida, there was a lot of Floridians who, we're going to call them companies for no other lack of term right now, that showed up at Pensacola to fight. They usually had some kind of a name as a company. They were formed by leading citizens in different counties that financed the whole thing. No uniforms. They were basically the same as what it would have been the Minuteman back during about the time of the Revolution. It was a come as you are with what weapon you had. Bragg's communication to his government and the state was, what am I supposed to do with these people? He arrived at Pensacola with a regiment of trained Alabama soldiers. And he asked the government if he should appoint officers over this group of Floridians that were down here. There was somewhere between, I think it was 6 and 8 companies approximately, of various strengths, but they were just camped around there. There was really no, other than a leader of each one of these groups. Bragg was just having a hard time because he didn't know what to do with them, and they weren't trained. And this picture here is, it is a picture that I found that was taken at Pensacola at approximately that time. Now, a little bit later on, we know Fort Sumter is going to get fired upon. And I'm going to move on to the next slide here. This gentleman right here, his name is Charles Seton Fleming. A little bit background on him. Mr. Fleming at this time, he's a graduate of the Rocky Mountain Military Academy. He graduated in '58. That's in one of the Carolina states. Now, what I want to bring up about him is he's very unique for people at that time from the standpoint that, remember, before the South seceded, the military already had standards of instruction that whether it was the West Point cadets, the different military academies, and then everybody who was a commissioned officer in the the Federal Army before the secession. These gentlemen were officers. They knew how to train soldiers. They got up in the morning at reveille. When these officers resigned and went with the South, they already had the and training of what had to be done to raise an army. He would join a group of soldiers that was raised by a man named Stark over around Jacksonville. And this was back in May of '61 after Sumter was fired upon. And Fleming joined them. They first went to St. Augustine, and they were called the Hamilton Blues. From there, after being there a couple of weeks, they moved to someplace called Number 10 on the St. John River, which the only thing I could find out was it was owned by Mr. Stark himself. For approximately 2 months, they lived on that piece of property, and Fleming trained them in the military discipline and drills and everything that he'd learned while he was at an academy. So this particular unit has some background as to what it's going to take for later on. And they will eventually, well, if I can back up a little bit, at this time, there was all these different groups of men, I call them. We can call them companies, but they were all communicating with the governor. At that time, it was Governor Perry. And they wanted to take a part in the war. So they want to be recognized and join in the fighting. They're volunteering their companies, as it would, for wherever and when that the governor could use them. What the governor did do with some of them was he took them to places and assigned them to where the Yankees, the federal government, had left. One of them was Fernandina. The guns were still there. There's different communications I've read about where different leaders had their men up there, and they're writing to the governor about, what are we going to do? Well, none of my men know how to fire the guns. Can you send me some artillery people to give us instruction? How long are we going to be there? And but eventually the Hamilton Blues, along with 9 other, 10 counting the Hamilton Blues, got the call from the governor, and they were to meet at Jacksonville at a place that would be known as the Brickyard or the Brick Church. And at this point, I think I'm ready to turn it over to Cindy, and she will introduce her ancestor.
I forgot about that one.
I skipped ahead on a slide.
Okay, as this marks the 160th anniversary of the Civil War, Steve and I decided to do our research, and we're visiting the grounds where my ancestors traveled and fought. The first one is my great-great-grandfather was to sign up was Elijah Nichols, and that has started our journey. Now, Elijah was a young man who, like many of his age, answered that call to take up arms and sign with the Leon Volunteers in Tallahassee on July 8th, 1861. From Tallahassee, they traveled across the state by rail to Jacksonville, and then went on up to Fernandina Beach. And as we know, it's right next to Fort Clinch. They stayed there for a few days, probably just hanging out, looking at the cannons and whatever. Then they traveled back down to Jacksonville to the old brick church, and that's where they rendezvoused. And that's just west of Jacksonville, now known as La Villa, and it's located in the train yard district. Next slide, you're going to see the image. This is the image of the street signs. The location of the cemetery has been determined to be just east of Myrtle Avenue on the south side of Duval Street and north of West Monroe Street. It's an abandoned wooden area. This video shows the outside perimeter of the outside of the cemetery. It's all wooded. Here's one of the streets right here. You see some buildings. Still has a brick road.
Now, that's what you've determined to be the old brick yard, correct?
The brick church.
Brick church.
Brick church. This is the old brick church cemetery. Now, on the other side of these buildings is the rail depot or the rail yard. This is on the inside of the cemetery. These posts here, you'll see these throughout. There used to be a fence around there. There's no markers. There's no graves. There were several little skirmishes held in here. See, Clay, you were asking me about the gate. We see all the posts up here.
Yeah. Do you think that's a period back? Do you think those were they
They
wood?
kind of look like big railroad ties that were put
Yeah.
in there. At one time, there was a chain link fence around it.
Huh.
But there's no signage or anything. Now, there are some people out there that are interested in preserving this, doing research in there, see if probably run the scanners and also at least put a marker up, because this was a very important spot during the war. This is a close-up of what we thought might be kind of like a gate. A little bit closer picture of it. See what that kind of looks like, a railroad tie or something?
Yeah.
I'm not sure what it is.
You know what's going to be interesting, Cindy, is the second Florida, of course, mustered in there on July 13th. Now
Yes.
the fifth and eighth aren't going to even form until next April. I wonder if they rendezvoused at the Brickyard in Jacksonville.
That will come. Well, that will come up down the road at that time.
Okay.
Blake.
I'm sorry. I'm getting ahead of myself because that's right where the railroad junction is. That would make
Yes.
sense. Okay.
That's a different story, Clay.
Okay, sorry.
Okay. And then
Hey,
here's
Sid, question. You mentioned there are skirmishes. Are you talking about modern reenactors that are using this property?
no, during the war, the Confederates and the Federals fought because of fought in that area because that's where the
Okay,
train was.
okay.
Mhm.
Yeah.
If
Okay, I
I
was
could,
just
well,
curious.
I'll interject a little bit here. If you read your history, the Yankees occupied Jacksonville, I think it was 3 separate times. And what they did for my readings in here was, and it was also by, I forget right now where it was at to quote it, but some people who actually took part in the skirmishes. They would land there at Jacksonville, the Yankees would send out patrols along. If you're right there, the street that comes in there, it's modern day, I think it's called Beaver Street. That's actually 90 that goes over to Olustee and follows a railroad. Okay, that's what the Yankees would take when they would go out, head towards Lake City at different times, even patrolling. This was the brickyard, brick church we call it, was within the gunboat artillery range. And at 2 or 3 different times throughout the war, the Confederates militia in Florida and the Yankees would meet each other on patrols, and they would hide behind the gravestones and shoot at each other. Maybe only 1 or 2 got killed, 1 or 2 got captured. It was a popular place. The Yankees knew that if they moved beyond the brickyard to the west, that they would be out of the covering fire from the gunboats. And when the Federals left, they destroyed everything to give it a field of fire and burnt the city down so that could not be used by the secessionists. Okay.
Okay, this is the oath that they would have taken on July 13th. And they were mustered into the Confederate service by Major W.T. Stockton. And I had to do some digging to find this oath. Because some people said, oh, they just changed out certain words and everything, but this was the actual oath that they would have taken. And this is Elijah Nichols' muster paper. E. Nichols, he was in Company D, 2nd Florida, Confederate. He was a private, and this was his card number. And these cards followed him throughout the war. If he was sick, it was put on there. If he was missing, whatever, in the hospital or whatever, then it would be put on here. Then after all of that was done, on Monday, July 15th, that was 2 days later, they left Jacksonville. If you notice this legend, it has different colors on here. Those are the different gauges of the tracks. So they left Jacksonville and they hopscotched their way, did a little stop here in Savannah. Then they just went all the way up to Richmond, which I believe is right up in here. And they left they were then the 2nd Florida Regiment. And it was composed of 10 companies. And they arrived in Richmond Sunday afternoon on July 21st. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Steve.
Okay. Now, looking at this same picture here, I'm just going to go over their traveling. Their first stop that they made, as you can see, when they left Florida, they stopped at Savannah. And in the writings, I believe it was of Fleming, that he talked about that they were greeted by this, I think it was a local militia unit that met them at the railroad station because they had to transfer trains. They were given an escort and a parade, and the city turned out for them. And when they got to the next depot at Savannah, before they boarded the train, they were given a generous feast. He said he'd never been fed so much food in his life. So they got on the train very well fed. From Savannah, they moved on up to the Fayetteville Arsenal, one of the federal arsenals that was seized by the secessionist movement. I came across a letter that was written by one of, at that time, Governor Perry's emissaries that he sent to do some coordinating on the logistics. And this gentleman wrote back to the governor that the Fayetteville Arsenal had enough weapons so that the 2nd Florida could exchange their weapons for modern weapons of no more than 1,000 of them that they had at that time. But if they got there, they could that they could take care of them. Then from Fayetteville, then they traveled on up to Richmond. Now, we're going to be talking about the camp of instruction itself. That's mainly what the presentation, in addition to the ancestry, was going to talk about for the specific time frame here. So remember when I mentioned that during this time, from the time that the Confederates seceded from the Union, for at least the first year, they were going through a lot of organizational changes. Secretary of War Walker was the third in a line of Secretary of Wars. That he was actually held that office for the longest period of time. At the beginning of the war, Judah P. Benjamin was the interim Secretary of War, and then a gentleman by the name of Randolph, I believe it was, took his place for a short time. And each one of these contributed to setting up the guidance for the camp of instruction. Now, this list here it's really a compilation of the different secretaries that I put together. You can go into the official records and see exactly each one of their guidances on what they had on it here. But basically, I'll just go down it real quick. That it says that said camps will be selected with reference to health and facilities for obtaining subsistence and transportation. That's pretty general. Number of camps will not exceed 2 without authority of the War Department. That changes later on in about a year or so. They will provide competent drill officers. This will be brought up, it has down there at the bottom. I'll go over a little bit more of this stuff. Then the commandants of regiments will provide muster to the camp commandant. They will establish support, which is you'll have a medical, some kind of facility there, bakeries, water, latrines. This is all stuff that will support the commissary, quartermaster. This will be basically, they are setting up what you would almost say we see this whenever we go to one of the reenactments. As reenactors, we go someplace to put on a battle, but you have to depend on people there that are the host that's going to, in our case, get you the porta-johns and where the water faucets and stuff like that are, and any other thing that you need to support them. That also dictates in here, what I think is unique on line number 6 is soldiers will be vaccinated. One thing that's unique about that, they didn't mention words of that. That's exactly what came out of the guidance right there. And the camp commandant will hold the rank of colonel. That's pretty apropos because every regiment that goes into these camp is commanded by a colonel. So naturally, you don't want the guy being less than a colonel. That's going to be the commandant. And the commandant will have a staff that will include an assistant surgeon, assistant quartermaster, commissary, adjutant. Basically, and we'll show you here in the next slide, not yet, but how that mirrors the regiments and their relationship. Drill master, the one secretary put down that the drill masters will come from Virginia Military Institute to be assigned to each one of the units that come in there. And that these camps will be set up in such a way that they will give instruction for infantry, artillery, and cavalry all at the same time. So you're going to have artillery batteries practicing and drilling at the same time infantry and cavalry are. Okay, now next one here. I put this in here. I don't want to really beat it to death a lot, but this is just like a relationship of, like I said, you could either look at it as one of our reenactments to where when our colonel gets there, or even our captain, and they say, where do we go? Where do we set up? Is there porta-johns? Is there latrines? Is there, like Dennis Short, I believe it was at Allsty, would bring us rations that they had there and stuff like this. So this is all very germane to what we do nowadays in some of this. And this goes on in the regular Army today also, from the standpoint that it's very common for a unit to go from one post to another on maneuvers. They don't bring everything with them if they can get barracks there or, facilities and stuff like this. Or Desert Storm took place, begin the first Gulf War, when they mobilized a lot of reserve and National Guard units. When those units went to Army bases, to the forts, those commanders had to go check in with the camp commander. And it's very important because, like, when the Second Florida got to their camp of instruction, all they had was from what I gather, was their bodies and what they were wearing. If they needed a wagon, that would have been issued to them by that quartermaster captain on the campsite. And all of their sport would come out of there. Their real estate, the colonel there is going to have to ask the camp commander, where do you want my men to sleep? Where do they camp out? So just look at this and just kind of compare who's going to be talking to who. And keep in mind, colonels don't micromanage and get right down in there at stuff. So they depend on the quartermaster at the regiment to talk to the quartermaster at the camp to do the coordinating. The colonel will only deconflict anything that cannot be resolved at the lower levels. Okay. Now, what I did find out in my research was that the War Department, Confederate War Department, did get with and contract with what was called the Virginia State Agricultural Society. They owned this piece of property that is right along the Richmond-Fredericksburg-Potomac Railroad outside of Richmond, just a short ways. It is a racetrack, and it's also used as a fairgrounds. And it's very good real estate to be setting up a base of operations and a camp of instruction, because you can see on here that they've got stables, got a lot of ground, they got grandstands, so there's probably some kind of latrines and already some established buildings in that. Now, most generally, from what I've been able to research, the cadre, the city town people, the commandant, would stay in the permanent buildings. And the questions that was asked to me about if a regiment came in there, see, regiments are in transit. They're only going to be there for a couple months. They probably stayed in tentage. It could be a lot of the pictures I saw of other camps, both north and south, were they had the Sibley tents that they had in rows and stuff like this. Those stayed behind when the regiment moved out. Remember that when the regiment is here, that, like I said, they will, if they're going to have tonnage, if each company is going to have a wagon, whatever their table of organization will be, they will, it is up to the camp commandant to work with the War Department and get that material to them before they move out. They're also, to work hand in hand with the drilling of the units on there. Now, I think we're ready to move on to our next slide. This is a camp of instruction that was in Iuka, Mississippi, I believe. And if you just take a look at it, about the only thing I could think of that they had common there was they got black hats. I can't tell what kind or anything like that. No specific uniform. I hope their weapons are all the same at that point. But I bring this up in here because at the camp of instruction in Richmond that the Second Florida was at that time, they had their drill instructor was a Major Cross that was assigned to the Second Florida as their drill master. And when he started out to train the regiment, what he found out real quick was he had this company here that turned out to be Company I believe, that the now Lieutenant Fleming belonged to. Captain Stark was voted in as the company commander, and Fleming was voted in as the first lieutenant. And Major Cross had been watching them, and he didn't have to do anything with them. They were so thoroughly drilled that Major Cross turned over the training of the regiment to Lieutenant Fleming. And Major Cross concentrated mainly on training the officers. on this. So he has lots of comments about how well the company I was in their training. They were heads and shoulders above the rest of the regiment. Okay. This next one here we have, this is actually a schedule and the guidance that was put out. Now, when I mentioned before at the beginning of the presentation that all the officers that had went to these military academies that belonged to the Federal Army before they resigned and went south, they already knew about training. So in all my research, I found that the way the Yankees trained was just very similar with hardly any changes to how the Confederates trained. The one you're looking at that I got here is probably the most thorough one I could find on paper. And it's actually for a signal unit in a Yankee camp. But I did like where it's highlighted on there about the instructions that, and the only thing I could say is if you take a minute to reading that while I'm talking is that I just have to smile and say, you're in the Army now. And Dwight last week made the comment that, boy, that looks a lot like when he went through basic training at Fort Jackson back about 40, 50 years ago. And I just kind of chuckled because, yeah, things do not really change that much. Reveille is still Reveille. It's not on there, but it's what I did find out was Reveille was for us reenactors, it's 5 a.m. In the summertime, 6 a.m. in the wintertime. And it's kind of unique because things don't change. Because I just imagine back in, if you could visualize, they blew up. You don't have to train somebody in bugle calls. Can you just close your eyes for a moment and imagine that you're sound asleep and it's 5 o'clock in the morning, you hear a bugle call and somebody comes in screaming at you to get up. And however they do it, whether it's modern times where they take a metal trash can and throw it down the barracks hallway and scream and holler at you, or back then a drill master is going to come down there and kick you in the legs because you're probably laying on the ground maybe or something like that, or a cot. Nothing really changes that much on this. And after you getting woke up that time for 3 or 4 or 5 times, you recognize that bugle call. Just like when you're hungry, you keep saying, well, I think it's noon. What do they do about, you're going to recognize chow call. This is repetitive drilling, repetitive instruction. And if you notice on there on this particular one, I don't know why I left out supper on the schedule there, but that would be, probably after 4 o'clock in the afternoon sometime. But if you look over like these right here, one of the biggest problems they had, remember these are citizen soldiers. And on top of that, geographically early in the war, these companies all came from the same county. These people knew each other before they even picked up the musket, you could say. They had problems with a private coming to a lieutenant and calling them on the first name basis. And I've read various little letters and stuff like this where a private got mad because he was thrown in the guardhouse by the lieutenant or the sergeant because he addressed him by his first name. Discipline was very harsh back then. And called a caste system. The South also had a problem with the discipline that there's letters that they thought they were being treated like slaves. They didn't understand that one guy hired a buggy so that he could ride it to his next assignment rather than marching with the unit. And guess what? He wound up in the guardhouse. So I guess you'll give you a minute to read down over some of the questions that was asked to me while you're reading this was the colonel does not make up the training schedule. There's a lot that has to go into this. This schedule would be the day-to-day training of the people that could start as a squad, progress up to a company. But there's, in a camp of instruction, just in a modern camp, when probably the lieutenant will make up the training schedule, with the input from the sergeants, it will be written up. In this particular case, this one I have down there, it says by order of Major Dorr. He probably was the adjutant. And this will be taken to the colonel or even the company at the company level. And if the commanding officer approves it, then he will sign it. So that's how one is made up. And another one, the reason it has to be put into this, when we look back the relationship, this camp commandant has got a lot of work going on. When he gets a regiment in there, that regiment's going to have to pull its own weight. So in addition to training on a daily basis, there's going to be either several days throughout the training period that some of his companies could be tasked to go chop wood for the entire camp, go dig more latrines. Back then, we'll see in a letter a bit later on the next slide that we had is they were also tasked with guard duty. First Manassas had ended and there was several thousand federal prisoners at this camp or close by, and these various regiments had to rotate guard duty on them, and also provost and guard duty at that guardhouse we talked about. So there are some times where you're going to be pulling guard duty, and other times you might be in that guardhouse, but then your neighbor from a adjoining company is going to be guarding you. So this all has to be worked out in the daily and the weekly training schedules to make sure that the training is taken along. Sanitation was not discussed back then. These camps were filthy. Men did not bathe. There was no attention paid to rifle marksmanship. All they cared about was at that time. Now, remember, this is the beginning of the war when it's just started. They're still using the old Napoleon tactics that based on muskets before the rifle muskets. So all they had to worry about basically was volley fire. And if they fired at will, from what I gather from my other research, that they would fire a volley, they would withdraw back, and another unit would pull forward, and they would fire that way while the other one is loading. Some of you Civil War experts out there might be more familiar with that tactic. And if they did fire a volley, they also had to be proficient at bayonet drill, because the bayonet was still very much in play early on in the war. I mentioned before that in the movie Gods and Generals, where Stonewall Jackson's at a place where he's on a horse talking to an officer, and he tells that officer, train him in the bayonet. The same scene shows them drilling on a field, and there's a couple soldiers that are complaining about, well, I could have stayed home and sat on the porch rather than just marching around all day long like this. This is boring. I think in the background, I noticed that there was another unit they had tricorn hats on. This is how early in the war it was that they still had not got organized. That was just unique for that in that movie. And they also had a guy named Pendleton in there, I think it was, or Pemberton, that was the chief of artillery for Jackson at that time. And, you know, his cannons were practicing on the same field and everything. So the last slide I have here is Cindy's going to read it to you. It's not from the 2nd Florida, but I couldn't find one, but it is from a corporal who, if you look at the date, he wrote this letter from the camp of instruction where the 2nd Florida was. So it gives you a little bit of an idea of what was going on there.
Dear Father and Mother, I take my pen in hand to let you know that I am well and hope that these few lines come to hand. They may find you enjoying the same blessing. I like the camp life fine. We are faring very well. We get light bread and bacon and rice and dried apples, coffee, beef, sugar, and some of our boys in the hospital, but they're all getting better. Father, we have not got our arms. We don't know when we will leave Richmond. Father, you know more about the news than I do. Besides, don't read anymore in this. Father and Mother, I have seen more since I've been in Richmond than you could shake a stick at. We have prayer meeting every night and preaching every Sunday. I have seen the very Yankees that we have about 3,000 prisoners and we got caps to wear, James. Sent word that we was hard-looking cases. You would laugh to see me rubbing the shirt tails. You are to see me making up bread, throwing the dough from east to west, Mother. I had my likeness taken and will send it to you the first chance. You can get it at Amsterdam Halt. Father, I would like to have about $3 if you can get it. If you do send me, be careful to direct your letter to Camp of Instruction, Richmond, Virginia, in care of PG Breckenridge. We don't drill much. I have stood guard once and we stand 2 hours and rest 4. And then the next day we can go into town and we see the very girls in Richmond. While I am writing, the boys are getting supper, some baking pies, some are eating. And so tell the girls to write to me. Tell Susie, write to me. We are all in spirits. Amen and amen. We have a jolly old time. Tell all the children howdy for me. I hear cannons firing every day. It is our artillery a practicing. The air throwing breastworks all around Richmond. My bad writing and spelling is nothing at present. Mossy John hammer away at the old guns. Write to me soon so I will know that you get my letters. Yours until death, so goodbye. James B. Painter, Corporal, Company K, 28th Virginia Infantry. If you send me some money, send it soon. We leave soon.
Okay, now, one last thing before we depart for today is Cindy and I's intention is that for the next 4 years, we've already made plans and everything. We're going to visit all the different places that her ancestors have been. We'll make videos, probably give presentations. You know, I've got superimposed maps over like Fredericksburg, so I know exactly where Perry's brigade was at there, and all the other battlefields in that. So this is going to be a continued onward journey for us. And like we did there at the Brickyard, we're hoping to give you panoramic views of what we've seen and everything. So we invite everybody to join us. We will only, unless it's a battle that's very famous, it might be that if we're called upon at a Zoom meeting monthly, but there's going to be some months where the research has not anything for that month. But I've already got some tidbit about the second Florida for next month that I did discover in the Richmond dispatches.
That's awesome, Steve. Hey, very good. Very good job, guys. Very good.
Yeah, very well done.
Our journey will continue.